Okay, we're back with another video about slavery apologetics for the Bible. This one we're going to change it up just a little bit. This is gotquestions.org. We're going to take a look at what they have to say about slavery in the Bible. I can't imagine it's going to be much different from what we usually hear. But just felt like switching up a little bit from cross-examined because their apologetics are all the same. But to be fair, all apologetics, especially for slavery, are about the same, because it's very hard to make up apologetics when you're dealing with a topic like slavery. But let's take a look at what they have to say.
Condone slavery. In this video, I'll answer that question.
Today's video, does the Bible condone? Yeah, the title of the video is Does the Bible condone slavery? So I pulled up the definition of condone, and it's to accept and allow, approve, or sanction. Let's see what he has to say. So I'm assuming sometime in this video he's going to give a yes or a no, but probably not. But let's see what he has to say about it.
Question from a
Spoiler
biblical
alert.
perspective.
Yes, it does.
Afterwards, as always, I'll share some helpful resources, so stick around until the end. There is a tendency to look at slavery as something of the past, but it is estimated that there are today over 27 million people in the world who are subject to slavery, forced labor, sex trade, inheritable property, etc. As those who have been redeemed from the slavery of sin, followers of Jesus Christ should be the foremost champions of ending human slavery in the world today.
Followers of Jesus Christ, non-followers of Jesus Christ, everybody should be the foremost champions of ending slavery in the world, not just Christians. Oh, look at that face. That's a good face. We should cut that out.
Today. The question arises, though, why does the Bible not speak out strongly against slavery? Why does the Bible, in fact, seem to support the practice of human slavery?
It doesn't seem to support the practice. The real question is, why does the Bible support the practice of human slavery?
Slavery in the Old Testament law. Slave ownership was a common practice long before the time the Mosaic Law was given. So the law neither instituted slavery nor ended it. Rather, the law regulated it.
Geez, this is just like Dan Kimball's slavery apologetics. They feel the need to say that God didn't create slavery. This is an argument that nobody makes. I don't see why apologists feel the need to bring it up. Maybe because it's all they have, and it sounds good.
It gave instructions on how slaves should be treated, but did not outlaw slavery altogether.
What a shame.
The law allowed for Hebrew men and women to sell themselves into slavery to another Hebrew. They could only serve for 6 years, however. In the 7th year, they were to be set free. Exodus chapter 21, verse 2. This arrangement amounted to what we might call indentured servitude, and the slaves were to be treated well. Do not make them work as slaves. They are to be treated as hired workers or temporary residents among you. Leviticus.
So far, it's a very generic slavery apologetics. There are some laws that would seem to be not the worst laws that you could possibly imagine that would apply to a slave, but we have to bear in mind that those laws in Exodus 21 apply to Hebrew slaves.
Leviticus chapter 25, verses 39 through 40. The law also specified that when you release them, do not send them away empty-handed. Supply them liberally from your flock, your threshing floor, and your winepress. Give to them as the Lord your God has blessed you. Deuteronomy chapter 15, verses 13 and 14. The freed slave had the option of staying with his master and becoming a servant for life. See Exodus chapter 21, verses 5 through 6.
So it says he had the option of staying with his master and becoming a servant for life. This is a really nice way to put the slave owner had a way to trick the slave into becoming a servant for life. Because what he's referring to is the rule where if you have a slave and he's a Hebrew slave and you are also Hebrew, and you have a female and you give him to your slave to be married, when the male slave his freedom is up, he has the option to stay with his wife and kids. Now, is that really is that a choice? Like, you can have your freedom, but you're going to be leaving your wife and kids behind, because what he's failing to mention is that the wife and kids stay behind as slaves For life, I do believe Exodus 21, 5 through 6. 5 through 6. So, okay, it doesn't say for life. If his master gives him a wife and she bears him sons or daughters, the woman and her children shall belong to the master, and only the man shall go free. This is what he refers to as the option to stay with his master for life. It's like, well, sure, but who's going to want to leave their family? And then if he does decide that he does not want to go free, then he will be his servant for life. Kind of makes that whole 6-year rule thing seem a little silly.
And becoming a servant for life.
I just wish apologists would be honest. Just mention all of these verses. Stop trying to cherry pick the verses that sound good and leaving out the rest of that verse. It's not just picking the verses that sound good. It's picking parts of the verse that sound good. Read the whole thing. Let people get an honest opinion. Nobody reads the Bible.
Life. See Exodus chapter 21, verses 5 through 6. When the Israelites conquered the land of Canaan, they were to drive out or destroy all the former inhabitants. However, that order was not fully obeyed, and many Gentiles remained in the land. God allowed the Hebrews to take slaves from among that population. Your male and female slaves are to come from the nations around you.
Okay, this is surprising. I'm going to give him some credit right here. Most apologists will not touch this verse because this verse is dealing with actual slavery. Everything he's talked about before is this form of absolutely terrible, disgusting indentured servitude, as they like to call it. But it's not slavery in the sense that we would view slavery today. This is slavery. Your male and your female slaves are to come from the nations around you. From them you may buy slaves. So does the Bible condone slavery, accept, and allow? Yes. Yes, it does. This is where the Bible condones slavery. You may buy slaves. They will become your property for life.
From them you may buy slaves. You may also buy some of the temporary residents living among you and members of their clans born in your country, and they will become your property. You can bequeath them to your children as inherited property and can make them.
How do you read this just so casually and just accept it? These are human beings we're talking about. You can buy a human being. If you die, you can leave that human being to your children in your will. They are your property for life. How do you read this and still think that this is not absolutely disgusting? This is coming from an omniscient, benevolent, omnipotent ruler of the universe, creator of the universe. These are his words. How do you read this and just accept it? It's mind-boggling.
Them slaves for life, but you must not rule over your fellow Israelites.
Yeah, you must not rule over your fellow Israelites ruthlessly. So what I'm assuming he's not going to do is clarify that the slaves that he was just talking about, the ones you buy from the nations around you, the ones you can own for life and they become your property. When it says you must not rule over your fellow Israelites ruthlessly, that's not applying to those slaves. That's applying to Israelite slaves, not the slaves from the nations around you, as it says right here. But he's not going to make that clarification because what he wants you to do is in your head be like, okay, well, you can buy them and you can own them for life, but you can't rule over them ruthlessly. Yes, you can. You absolutely can. This protection here didn't apply to the slaves from the nations around you.
Ruthlessly. Leviticus chapter 25, verses 44 through 46. So the law did allow for slavery. Several laws regulating slavery appear in Exodus chapter.
The law did allow for slavery. Is he going to say yes? Is he going to say yes that the Bible does condone slavery? He said he's going to answer the question.
21. These laws gave some basic rights to slaves and curtailed the actions of masters in a historically unprecedented way. In the ancient world outside of Israel, slaves had no rights.
You're a liar. He's lying right now. In the entire world, nowhere did slaves have any rights at all. the Egyptian slaves, the Greek slaves, nowhere? Come on, back that up with some evidence. That's ridiculous.
But God's law extended to slaves the right to keep a wife, in verse 3, the right not.
So again, he won't make this clarification, so I will. He's talking about Hebrew slaves owning other Hebrew slaves. These rules or these laws don't apply, these protections, as he calls them, don't apply to slaves that are not God's chosen people.
Not to be sold to foreigners, verse 8, the right to be adopted into a family by marriage, verse 9, and the right to food and clothing, verse 10.
What?
By marriage, verse 9, and the right to food.
The right to be adopted into a family by marriage? Okay. This is, and I've heard a lot of apologetics for slavery. This is, who is this guy? Because this is the most absolutely disgusting, lying, dishonest slavery apologist I've heard yet. The right to be adopted. It's frustrating. It's very frustrating to hear apologetics for slavery. It's my man just said that slaves had the right to be adopted into a family by marriage. Exodus 21 verse 9. Wow. So what he's referring to here, Exodus 21 verse 9, is the verses before it, which he's not going to read. Because, hold on. I was not expecting this. This is, I've never heard this apologetic before, and that's a good thing, because this is awful. This is an awful, okay. Let me reel it in a little bit. So Exodus 21 verse 9, the verses before it are about when a father sells his daughter into slavery. And the person that he sells her to, if she's not pleasing him, he can give that daughter, the slave that he purchased, he can give that woman to his son to be married. That's the worst form of adoption that I've ever heard in my life. After the father has used up the slave, he can give her to his son to use, and they will be married. And this repugnant, I try not to swear in my videos, I really do, so I'm kind of at a loss for words, but this person just referred to that as adoption. Let that sink in. If you buy a female slave, if a father sells his daughter to you and she's not pleasing you enough, you can then give her to your son. And this is what he's calling adoption. You sick person. Wow.
Food and clothing.
Wow.
Verse 10. The law also limited
Yeah, they have to give food and clothing. Sure. That's great.
masters in their use of corporal punishment. Verses 20 and 26 through 20.
The law also limited their use of corporal punishment, basically excluding death. Everything else seems to be perfectly allowed. I mean, you could still go in and you can whip them. I mean, I guess you can't rule over them ruthlessly, but as long as you can beat them with a rod, I do believe it says, you just can't kill them. And it doesn't necessarily say that you can't kill them. It says if you beat them with a rod, and if they don't die in a day or two, then you're not to be punished. But I guess it doesn't really cover if they die in 3 or 4 days from the wounds. There's internal injuries. Excuse me, that might take a little while. But okay, great. So you can beat them, you just can't kill them. This is coming from God. I mean, that's all right. Let's keep going.
27. Under the Mosaic law, and if economic circumstances demanded it, a Hebrew had the option of selling himself as a slave to a Gentile living in Israel. Leviticus chapter 25, verse 47. The law also provided for the slave's redemption at any time, verses 48 through 52. And the treatment of the Hebrew slave was to be considerate. Slaves were to be treated as workers hired from year to year. You must see to it that those to whom they owe service do not.
So I was a little bit impressed that he brought up the actual form of slavery. He didn't bring up all of them. He didn't bring up like captives of war, or like prisoners of war. He didn't bring that up, that aspect of slavery where it says you can use them as forced labor and own those people for life. But he did bring up one that I haven't heard the other apologists bring up before. So I was a little bit impressed. But after that whole adoption, bizarre, the most sick, twisted form of adoption you could possibly imagine. Well, maybe not possibly imagine, but you get my point. But then he goes back into all the rules that apply to Hebrew slaves. I just wish I wish all apologists would say the Bible got it wrong and this is disgusting. We don't know why it's in there. I mean, I would accept that. I mean, of course, I would then question, well, then why do you keep ruling a God who would allow for such abhorrent nonsense? But at least it would be a decent apologetic. I don't know. The Bible got this wrong. Maybe some humans wrote it in somewhere. Anything except that it wasn't as bad as it seems, or lying and twisting and manipulating the words to make them seem better than they actually are. But again, we're going back to Hebrew slaves.
Not rule over them ruthlessly. Verse 53. If no redemption came, the slaves were still released with their families on the year of Jubilee. Verse 54.
Yeah, the year of Jubilee. What is that? Every 80 years? Take into account the life expectancy of a person back then. So even if you were a slave when you were born, you would be 80, or every 80th year. If you were, just think about that. The 80th year.
4. New Testament instruction on slavery. Even in the New Testament era, the Bible did not demand that every slave owner immediately emancipate his slaves. Rather, the apostles gave instructions to slaves and their owners on godly behavior within that social system. Masters were admonished on the proper treatment of their slaves. For example, in Ephesians chapter 6, verse 9, masters are told, treat your slaves in the same way with goodwill. Do not threaten them, since you know that he who is both their master and yours is in heaven, and there is no favoritism with him. Elsewhere, the command is, masters, provide your slaves with what is right and fair, because you know that you also have a master in heaven. Colossians chapter 4, verse 1. Jesus and the apostles did not outright condemn slavery. They didn't need to.
Yes, they did. Yes, they did. They had a second chance. So you have all the awful stuff from the Old Testament, and then you get a second shot at it, and you still get it wrong. So you have a God who's, in whatever form he is, zooting down to earth, doing his thing. But as far as I can tell, he wasn't like a physical being. And he got all those rules wrong. And then he has a second chance and gets it wrong again when he himself is in the flesh, if you buy the Trinity nonsense. And he still gets it wrong. And he says they didn't need to. I mean, it would have been really nice. Part 2. Hey, you know all that stuff about slavery? You got it wrong. Let's end it. It would have been very simple.
The effect of the gospel is that lives are changed one by one, and those changed lives in turn bring transformation to entire families, clans, and cultures. Christianity was never designed to be a
So he's going with the argument that this was designed to change hearts and minds and stuff over time. But the story of the Exodus, even if you put it at 1500 BCE and you take into account that it's, we'll just say 2000 years, 1500, so we're looking at roughly 3500 years later. And what did he say? Oh, where are my subtitles? What did he say at the beginning?
tendency to look at slavery as something of the past, but it is estimated that there are today over 27 million people in the world.
3,500 years later, and it's estimated today that there are still 27 million people in slavery. If God's plan was to start changing minds one by one, slowly over time, well, I guess he accomplished it. But the key word there is very, very slowly. How many more thousands of years do we have to wait for the Bible to do what it was set out to do and start the ending of slavery? How many more thousands of years do we have to wait? Come on, man. Where were we? I think we're somewhere around here.
Christianity was never designed to be a political movement, but over time, it naturally affected political policy. Alexander McLaren wrote that the gospel meddles directly with no political or social arrangements, but lays down principles which will profoundly affect these and leaves them to soak in the general mind.
What does this have to do with slavery?
In nations where Christianity spread and took firm hold, slavery was brought to an end through the efforts of born-again individuals. The seeds of the emancipation.
No. See, this is another argument that I don't buy. Slavery was brought to an end through the efforts of born-again individuals. You don't get to use the Bible, Old and New Testament, as a way to justify owning a human being as another human being for thousands of years. And then when the world starts to change and realize that this is wrong, and in that regard, the Bible or the Christians change with the world, kicking and screaming, dragged along, mind you, and then get to claim that you're the ones that pushed to end slavery after thousands of years of using the Bible to justify it? Sorry, nope.
The seeds of the emancipation of slaves are in the Bible, which teaches that all men are created by God. And
I mean, this is the slowest growing tree in the world if the seeds of emancipation are in the Bible. Because there's still, by his own admission, an estimated 27 million slaves 3,500 years later. Ridiculous.
Made in his image, which condemns those who kidnap and sell a person, and which shows
kidnap and sell a person. That condemns those who kidnap and sell a person. I'm tired of this apologetic too. This is a law to protect your slave. That's what this law is. When it condemns kidnappers, it's not condemning them for kidnapping a human. What it's doing is condemning them for kidnapping another slave. This is Hebrew laws. This is laws that apply to Hebrews owning other Hebrews. That's it. So the law protects the slave owner from having his slave stolen. That's it. There's no more to it. They try to make it seem like kidnappers were condemned in a broad sense, but it was just to protect the slave owner from having his property, by property I of course mean another human being, stolen.
Shows that a slave can truly be a brother in the Lord. Some criticize the Bible because it did not demand an immediate overthrow of every ingrained, centuries-old, sinful custom of the day.
No, not every centuries-old, ingrained, sinful custom of the day. We're talking about slavery. We're talking about the practice of owning a human as property. We're not talking about um, telling a lie, which the Bible says thou shalt not lie. We're talking about human beings owning other humans. So the Bible is not criticized for ending every ingrained century-old sinful custom of the day. It's being criticized because it didn't own one of the most disgusting practices that you could possibly imagine. And in fact, condones it, which he still hasn't given the yes or no on.
But as Warren Worsby pointed out, the Lord chooses to change people and society gradually through the ministry of the Holy Spirit and the proclamation of the truth of the Word of God. Want to learn more?
I don't know if I would ever use the word gradually for how the Bible is changing minds on slavery. Gradually seems like it has an end goal. It's evolution takes place faster than how the Bible is gradually changing slavery. So I guess overall, I'm going to start looking at videos from gotquestions.org because that adoption thing got me, and it's still circling through my head here. This was by far the worst slavery apologist I've heard yet, and I've heard a lot, but it's disgusting.